Okay, we are going to get started. Welcome everyone to the Voice of San Diego live stream event on student safety in the age of online learning. I'm Ashley McGlone, and my colleague Kayla Jimenez and I are reporters at Voice of San Diego. We've spent nearly 3 years digging into cases of school employee sexual misconduct across the region's 42 K-12 public school districts. We actually were putting together a live in-person event to highlight some of our findings and bring to you some changes that were actually happening in this arena before the coronavirus pandemic hit. And then that changed everything, and now we aren't allowed to gather in groups. And so, and the way that education is delivered has dramatically changed. In fact, online interactions between teachers and students is greater than ever. And so we actually felt really strongly that we had some really important information that we wanted to share with you all, and that it just couldn't wait. And we also wanted to connect you with some key stakeholders that are monitoring this issue and have some information to share as well. Not all teachers, first up, we understand, are looking to do inappropriate things with students online. But unfortunately, through the investigation that we've done and the public school district records that we received using the state's Public Records Act, we did uncover some patterns and trends and ways in which the accountability system that does exist to protect students hasn't always worked, and ways in which school employees haven't always been held accountable. Kind of 3 ways that we saw this was sometimes we would see complaints pile up in an employee's personnel file and sort of remain behind the scenes for years as students came and went and little to no discipline was given. Another thing that we saw was, school districts that dealt with problem employees would sometimes move them school to school and place to place and reassign them. And that was sort of their response to dealing with these issues, even with substantiated sexual misconduct. And another thing that we saw quite a bit of across the region were resignation deals. School districts and school employees, either under investigation or found responsible for sexual misconduct with students, would negotiate separations that included confidentiality clauses that would prohibit the school district employer from then sharing with other employers those past bad acts, and that would enable them to move on and continue to work with children. One other thread that we've seen a lot, and that is of utmost importance now, was the use of technology to foster inappropriate relationships between students and teachers. We saw, late night text messages, and we saw Facebook, messages on social media, and establishing separate email accounts outside of the purview and view of the school district employer. And so Kayla is actually going to share some very specific examples that we've seen in these case files to just kind of give you a glimpse of what this could look like.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley, for teeing that up. One of the most jarring trends that we found was this use of social media and emails and personal electronic communications used by teachers to communicate with students outside of the classroom. So those conversations turned from homework, conversations in the middle of the day about homework, and then they turned into like good night texts and more intimate conversations about family and different things. And those were a lot of the patterns we found were over Facebook and over text messages, and then personally created emails aside from district emails. To name a few of those cases that we reported on, one of them was at Westview High School in the Poway Unified School District. There we found two male teachers who at 2 different times sent inappropriate text messages to their students. In one case, a slew of text messages were sent to a teenage student, like, "Good night, sweetie. Should I be jealous that you have a new best friend?" to a 12th grade student in his physical education class. And another was a coach who sent a text message to a basketball coach telling her that he had an inappropriate dream about the student. So both of those teachers remain at Westview High, even though the district knows about these situations that didn't exactly lead up to sexual acts. And that's something that we've also found in our reporting, is that sometimes they don't and sometimes they do. And in one case at El Camino High in Oceanside, a JROTC teacher actually used Facebook Messenger to invite one of his students over to his home, and then would make comments calling her gorgeous on Facebook. And that situation escalated into sexual abuse and led to the student requesting to leave the school, actually. And so we see here that there are a variety of ways that the teachers who may even be beloved teachers at the school, use social media, text messages, and other ways to interact with students outside of the classroom. Districts like Poway Unified and San Diego, and one state agency that is a policymaker for various school districts around the state, the California School Board Association, have implemented pretty clear policies that outline what students can and can't do to interact with each other over electronic communications, and that includes not friending students, a direction to teachers to not friend their students on social media, and to always include a coach, a teacher, or a parent in a conversation. So there's never a one-on-one message interactions with students directly. And now we thought it was more important than ever to have this conversation because schools are moving online, and as things move entirely online, school districts are figuring out what to do as they are scrambling to get students and teachers online, interacting, learning from a distance, and dealing with these policies that they had in place, which said that teachers shouldn't be interacting with students and vice versa online. And so we felt it was important tonight, and now especially, to bring together some key stakeholders to share what's happening now and what parents, students, and teachers can do to be aware of this issue and some warning signs to look out for. So tonight we have 4 panelists, and we're grateful to have them join us today. We have San Diego Unified School Board member Richard Barrera, San Diego County District Attorney Summer Stephan, Billy Joe Grant, a researcher at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and board member for the nonprofit Stop Educators Sexual Abuse, Misconduct, and Exploitation. And last but not least, Mariah Brogdon, a former Chula Vista High School student who has firsthand experience with this issue. So during the event, feel free to send us questions on the chat. I believe it's on the sidebar here, and we'll do our best to get it answered during a Q&A session at the end of the panel. Now I'm going to turn it over back to Ashley, who will get started with our discussion.
Thank you, Kayla. I hope you all can hear me okay. First up, I am privileged to have Mariah Brogdon here. She is a former Chula Vista High School student who, again, unfortunately does have firsthand experience with this issue. For those of you not familiar with her case, we have reported on it fairly extensively on voiceofsandiego.org, so you could read more details about the case and the outcome there. But just to recap briefly, Mariah and 2 other female students did ultimately take the step in early 2017 to come forward to school officials and report inappropriate behavior by their show choir teacher at Chula Vista High. The inappropriate behavior included electronic messages, verbal communication, and physical contact. The school district did launch a several-month investigation that ultimately concluded that the harassment by this teacher was severe and pervasive. He did deny these allegations, but did ultimately negotiate a departure deal, a resignation deal that did have one of those very familiar confidentiality clauses. An investigation by Chula Vista Police Department and the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing did open and close a case without taking any public action, so he is free to continue teaching across the state as we speak. But Mariah, I wanted to talk to you specifically about your experience as a student and what it's like to be a student when you encounter something like this. So if you can just take me back to the beginning, what do you remember? Like, how did your teacher even begin to establish contact with you outside of the classroom, and why, and what do you remember about it?
So basically there was a Facebook group that was made. It included all members of the show choir class that I had in high school, some of their parents, and then the show choir teacher. And basically the purpose for this page was to, for example, if we had any upcoming performances, someone would post what we needed to bring, what we needed to have with us, and sort of any last details that we might have needed to know. But since it was a Facebook page, we were connected through our personal Facebook accounts. So if someone wanted to, they could potentially reach out and message via Messenger through Facebook.
Got it. And so what kind of messages did he begin sending to you, and what kind of requests did he end up making? And I recall some of these details from the investigative file, but for those that are less familiar, catch us up to speed on what some of those messages contained.
Yeah, so if I wouldn't show up to school sometimes, he'd message me like, "Where were you today? You know, I missed you." Or send me a picture of you wearing the lipstick that you're going to wear for the show. Or do you want to go out to see a show, you know, later at night, and just late night text messages and things like that.
Did those requests strike you immediately as inappropriate, or did it seem, you know, more normal because he was a show choir teacher and not like a math teacher or a science teacher making those kinds of requests?
Yeah, so in other cases, we'd be having a discussion, you know, over Messenger or whatever, about, you know, music or production plans and things like that. And then he'd throw in, you know, like a winky kissy face or a heart, and sort of these, you know, unnecessary intimate undertones to the things that he'd be saying. And I'm glad that you mentioned, you know, he is a choir teacher. So that's something I wanted to point out. He is a choir teacher, you know, which does require after school rehearsal and, you know, costumes and, you know, things that you wouldn't necessarily talk about with your regular, you know, math or English teacher or something like that. And, you know, not only that, but he also made himself very relative to the students. He was seen as, you know, the cool teacher, and students could get away with a lot more in his classes, and he would joke with us like we would joke around with each other. So I mean, I did think it was weird and, you know, even creepy at times, but because of those things, it was sort of hard to differentiate, you know, is it all jokes and these comments and text messages are just innocent tendernesses, or, you know, is it actually, you know, something more?
So I know and recall from, again, the district's investigative file that those discussions about which lipstick to wear and which dresses to buy that started on digital communications did actually lead to actual shopping trips to the mall. And he took you and a friend, at least on at least one occasion I know was detailed pretty in depth, that lasted several hours. Could you tell me a bit more about that trip and kind of what happened that really left an impression with you?
Yeah, so I had gotten a main role for the show choir class I had in high school. And the show choir teacher had told me that he wanted to take me shopping for a dress for the role. And he had intended for me to go alone. I wasn't comfortable with going alone, so I made an excuse for a friend who actually happened to be on the show choir as well, to come with me. And this particular friend was actually sort of already aware of me being uncomfortable with him, or sort of my concerns with being alone with him. So she went along with us, and I tried on over 20 dresses. We went to multiple stores, multiple malls even. And while I was trying on dresses, he pulled out his phone and he just started taking pictures of me, you know, in the dress, not, you know, asking if it was okay, not, you know, telling me why, not asking if I was comfortable with it. You know, he just sort of, you know, did it. So. And there was one dress in particular that my friend went into the dressing room with me, and we tried it on, and it ended up being super low cut, very tight, very, very short. I'm a tall girl. It just didn't fit me in any of the right ways. And we looked at each other and we were like, there's no way you're going out of the dressing room, you know, looking like that. So while I, you know, changed back into my regular clothes, she went ahead and let the teacher know, you know, this isn't a good option. We're going to have to find something else. She's changing right now. And instead of, you know, being understanding and being like, okay, you know, maybe there's another option we can find or something, he told her, no, go in there, tell her to put the dress on and come out. I want to see it anyway. And so I did. And we put on the dress. And again, it was very, very short, very low cut. So I came in covering myself, covering my breasts. And he pulled out his phone, and before he took pictures, he told me to put my hands at my sides, and then told me, you know, turn right, turn left, turn around, just took pictures.
And those specific details, again, were included by the investigator, were witnessed by your friend, and something that was cited in his recommendation for termination. That it was such a jarring encounter. I appreciate you revisiting that with us. Again, we know that those electronic communications became, you know, photographic things, and then did later escalate into even some physical touching. And you and other students did ultimately come forward, and those investigations were opened initially by the school district officials Tell me a bit about what that process is like as a student when that investigation happens. And do you have any advice for school district officials or law enforcement that are talking to students who either themselves have come forward to make a complaint like this or are too afraid to, but they've got a tip and need to try to find out if it's true? Any thoughts on any of that?
I feel like for both the, school officials and for the investigative side of it, just don't direct a question to a student that's insinuating a reaction of theirs is a cause of events. These are underage, 15 to 17-year-olds that we're talking about. And, it doesn't matter if they had a nervous reaction and, maybe giggled because they felt uncomfortable or, didn't go right up to the teacher and, confront them because maybe they didn't quite know how. Whatever the case, these students aren't authority figures and they weren't put in a position of power. That teacher was. That teacher was tasked, with uplifting students and, teaching us and helping us get through, what is an already, dynamic and difficult time in our lives. And, for anyone to think that any blame goes on a student, truly doesn't understand the power dynamic and, the predatory mental mind gap between a 15-year-old girl and a 50-year-old man. And something that I actually, sorry for going back, but
No, go ahead.
That last dress that I tried on out of over the 20 dresses that I tried on over the multiple malls that we went to, multiple stores, out of all those, he told the friend that I went with that was his favorite dress. And since I couldn't move in it, he wanted to cut slits in the side so I can move. And that was the only dress he bought that day. So just for an idea of the behavior and the thinking process.
Well, again, Mariah, I so appreciate you sharing. That was so powerful. I kind of lastly wanted to ask you if you have any advice for students or parents or administrators or even other teachers, ways in which we can prevent this type of contact that you've described, especially over electronic devices. Obviously, the broader issues that we've discussed as well. But do you have any advice that comes to mind as to how to make sure this isn't happening to other students?
Yeah, I feel like the mistake I made was I was sort of expecting a blatant open comment, like not necessarily an explicit comment, but something that just very clearly crossed the line. And, for me, because it wasn't put that bluntly, I was sort of on this fence of, is it or is it not as serious and bad as I'm thinking, it might be. And, because that was the case, things happened and things escalated and I wasn't really aware of, what to look for. So, for parents and students and, whoever's willing to listen, it's not always going to be right there and in your face. Just because he didn't use certain verbiage, doesn't mean that there wasn't anything wrong with the picture. And I know it's not as easy as it's chalked up to be, but just try to be involved with your kids, just listen and take notice because not all kids are going to bring things like this up, especially. And just take it upon yourselves, to ask your students what they think about their teachers. And even if they don't have anything to say right away about it, at least you made that an open topic of discussion for them to think about and maybe even come back to later and be like, hey, you know what, there is something that now that you mention it, I want to tell you or I need to tell you or whatever the case. So.
That is good stuff. Mariah, I thank you so much for sharing and being willing to do this whole exercise with us. I know it wasn't maybe the easiest thing in the world. And I know you're going to actually jump off the broadcast, but thank you again. And we're going to talk to some other folks who will touch upon some of the changes that are happening to hopefully improve the system as it stands. So thank you again. I really appreciate it. And I'll hand it back to Kayla for our next panelist.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mariah. Yeah. Make sure I'm not muted. Thanks, Mariah, for sharing. That was really important. And we hear from a lot of students who share their stories with us, the detail events like that. And that I hope that shines through in our reporting. So Summer Stephan, the San Diego County District Attorney, is here. I know that this has been an important issue on your radar. And you took the lead a few months ago in the fall on establishing a task force to address these issues. I wanted to ask you, a lot of the cases like Mariah's at Chula Vista High, we've investigated of inappropriate electronic communications between teachers and students don't end up getting prosecuted. What makes prosecuting these cases hard, and what kind of evidence does it take to prosecute?
So clearly, Mariah is a very courageous young lady, and what she said was spot on. And it's kind of what she described about what her sense was as to what is that line where it makes something in a communication illegal to the point where a kid will know there's something illegal, improper here. And also for a prosecutor and to be able to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's that line between what is grooming behavior and what is actually a criminal act. And that's the line that makes things difficult. So most of the time, kids and victims do not report grooming behavior. The times that we get a case that's actually a case that we can investigate and prosecute, we're well past grooming into the stage of somebody committing a sexual offense. So we then look back and we see in their communications, because of course, as part of the investigation, we do search warrants, we follow ECPA, which is all of the hurdles we have to go through to get people's phones and devices. We track back, lots of times messages are deleted, but we download, and we find that at the end of months of communication that's clearly grooming, sprinkled in there is a couple of things that cross from grooming to an actual enticing or an invitation to commit or to engage in a sexual event. When it crosses into that, that's a crime that's prosecutable even if the sexual conduct doesn't happen, but that you've enticed the child, you've invited a sexual communication. That's the age-old struggle, and it begins with the fact that the schools still teach kids about stranger danger. And when the reality is that 90% of minors and 80% of adults who are sexually abused are abused by someone in their circle of trust, or someone who enters their circle of trust for the purpose of sexually abusing them or exploiting them. So we need to shift the conversation, and Mariah hit on this, the conversation where we're not just talking about stranger danger, because then we have our kids like sitting ducks waiting until they're finally fully victims of sexual exploitation before the aha moment comes, because the whole time that bad things are happening, they have a sense that something is wrong, but no one has actually given them clear permission to report and to act, because we're still stuck on the stranger danger, which is only 10% of the cases.
Can I ask a quick follow-up clarification question, Kayla? This might be getting a little bit in the weeds, but that PC, I don't remember the code, but the annoy or molest a minor charge, that in and of itself doesn't typically require, a physical sex act, right? But we do typically only see that maybe accompanying, more severe charges. Is that the case? And is there in a time where you would consider charging the annoy and molest a minor charge alone, or again, is it just really difficult, practically speaking, to really proceed with those kinds of cases?
We have, and we can, and it's Penal Code Section 288C1, which says, that you don't have to actually get to the touching part, but that a lewd and lascivious event can be prosecuted with a minor, but you need all of these hurdles, that the language is such to display a clear sexual interest and is meant to sexually gratify the person, which sometimes as you look through speech, whether it's bantering or inappropriate speech, or whether it crosses over to an actual invitation to engage in a sexual activity. So we look at all of that, and we do charge those things when they're there, but oftentimes nothing is really reported to us until we're past it and we have a minor that's already a victim. And this is why, like Kayla mentioned, I've been obviously following your articles, and it is near and dear to my heart, because a lot of attention has been missing from this area. You know, we see news media cover whenever you have a stranger jumping out of the bushes and sexually assaulting a minor. We get a ton of coverage over those cases. But when you have someone in a position of trust that does this, and it's almost like it's lesser, when in fact, in my experience, it's almost more traumatic in many ways, because it completely dismantles the child's trust in adults that are supposed to be trusting people that they can trust and rely on. We see ripple effects, and it's documented in research, and maybe the researcher will talk about this, that it causes years of events like this. This is why I started the sex crimes division, a dedicated division, back in 2003 to 2005, because the cases involving non-stranger contact and that are more difficult and need a lot more investigation were kind of put on the back burner. And we needed to bring a lot of attention to it because it's so harmful to our kids. And what is really, really harmful is if we don't act, and if we have these idiotic non-disclosure agreements, it's essentially kind of like a cooperation with allowing this person to continue and to continue teaching, to continue in their positions of trust. I've been trying to work with changing federal legislation to not allow these non-disclosure agreements when it comes especially to minors, at a minimum when it comes to conduct towards minors.
Thanks for bringing that question up, Ashley. I know that's one that comes up on a lot of people's minds. And thank you so much for bringing up grooming. Just for the audience who don't know what grooming is to define in simple terms, seemingly harmless acts like sending a text message or giving a student a ride home from school, as we've reported, that turns into sexual abuse in the long run over a period of time. And I hope to get Billie Jo to touch on that a little bit later on. Summer, I wanted to ask you, we know that the DA's office implemented a task force to oversee child abuse cases in schools in the fall. What is the task force doing now to address the issue?
Right. So we heard from the community and from communities of color, especially in the African American communities and other communities, that sometimes the voice of parents and the voice of kids is not being heard, that there's lapses in reporting, in mandated reporting. And so we wanted to create an easily accessible place where people can report those things. We already prosecute sexual abuse in 2 units, depending on age, but we didn't have a platform where there's an easy access to tell us, I reported this, I told the principal this was happening, and I'm not sure anything is going on. I see the teacher still continuing. Those sort of reports we were very concerned about. And sometimes also we heard that people are afraid to report because they're afraid of consequences and repercussions. And so we started this student safety task force with Stephen Marcotte, a very experienced prosecutor, leading it. And it allows that contact with us and reports. And even with the short time that we've had that going, we've been able to bring a case forward for prosecution. And we're very proud of that. But at least even where there wasn't a prosecution, we did the follow-up. We checked with the child abuse hotline, was this reported? Because they have to tell us the answer, even if they don't tell just a lay citizen the answer.
And we reported a few weeks ago that the number of reports to the task force has virtually stopped since the lockdown happened. And then I know you had said that that's not necessarily a good thing. What do you mean by that?
I'm very, very concerned about that because, while we understand the wisdom of the stay-at-home orders, it also means that kids, knowing these statistics, that it's often somebody in your circle of trust, that means that kids are not going to school. And as we all know, there are so many great teachers that go into that profession to be there for kids. And they're ones that do report and see the signs of kids looking depressed, looking down, bruises, truancy, all of those things are not getting reported. And I checked with the child abuse hotline, and in fact, it's not just the reporting to our website that has gone down. It is also almost half of the reports to what it would be at this time in April to the child abuse hotline are they've been diminished by 50%, and that's a huge concern. And the reason it's a huge concern to me is because, in contrast to that, the reports to the Internet Crimes Against Children, those are child pornography images that are being reported to the ICAC, our Internet Crimes Against Children, has tripled in this time period. So what we do know from that is kids are getting abused. And it is just essentially what I lose sleep over, because we need to be able to reach those kids, and they're in this home environment with people in chat rooms, in game rooms, asking them to send pictures, maybe potentially in some cases trafficking them, having them expose their body, selling that pornography. And we know that this trend in San Diego is not just San Diego, it is a trend nationwide, where in April, 4 million reports came in with regard to the NCMEC, which is the missing and exploited children. So you see a drop in reporting, but yet an increase in runaway kids and pornographic images.
So how can parents, students, and community members report suspected abuse then? And what signs should they be looking for?
Well, you need to really, I mean, this is something I sent a letter with Superintendent of Schools, Paul Gothold, to all of the teachers, saying they need to be, even if they're Zooming and doing or video conferencing with kids, they need to at least call on each child and be able to put eyes on, be able to communicate and see if there's anything wrong. Do the best that you can to still observe signs of abuse. Also, be your brother's keeper. We know that teachers often know about other teachers that aren't conducting themselves properly. You see teacher aides seeing conduct that's not appropriate. And more than ever, that conduct needs to be reported so it can be stopped in its tracks, because that's the grooming behavior that then leads to further damage. But notice, if kids are supposed to be part of your group and they're not there, then that has to be reported. Parents, really do look at what your kids are doing in their room. They're at home for many hours, which is hours that can be used by abusers that come into their circle of trust, or abusers who are already in their circle of trust and find this time very convenient to continue their abuse. So it's important to ask questions. I tell parents, and I know a lot of privacy advocates don't like this, but I think if you bought your kid's phone, you should have the password, and you should be able to at least gain the trust so that they can go through it with you. Like our brave student said, ask those questions. Ask your kid, how is it going? Who are you talking to? Has anybody asked you for anything that's uncomfortable to you? Ask all of those questions, and give empowerment to kids to understand that they own their body, and that people should not be asking them to do anything with their body that's not comfortable for them.
And for clarification, where should teachers who are mandated reporters by the state law, who are required to report suspected child abuse, and parents and community members, where is the place that they should be reporting these signs?
Well, obviously, don't forget 911. If you think a kid is in danger right now and you have a reason to believe that, call 911 so we can help that child. But also, you have to report to the child abuse hotline. So the child abuse hotline is a reportable hotline, but I would report to both. If you're a mandated reporter, you report to the child abuse hotline, but I always recommend reporting to both law enforcement and the child abuse hotline. My dream for the coming future is to work with the child abuse hotline and law enforcement to create a link by which nothing is missed. So automatically a report is then viewed by law enforcement so that we don't have anything kind of falling through those gaps.
Thanks for making that clarification. One more thing, because I know that you mentioned that predators usually are drawn to vulnerable young people and students. So teachers are being urged now by school districts to check in on vulnerable students to make sure they're online learning. But we know that it's those students who are most vulnerable to predatory school employees. So how can schools make sure that the current crisis isn't being used to exploit kids?
It is very difficult. Those bad apples, make us worry, because it is a good idea to check in on those students, and for the large majority of good teachers, that's a good thing. But what I've always recommended is for schools to have policies that that a teacher doesn't text a child without including their parent on that communication. And also on any kind of a call or a check-in, having a parent there, unless you have a good reason to think that it is the parent who is the abuser because of prior history or other things. Then maybe you, with another teacher, call that student. So I think that's really important to set those kinds of systematic policies so that you can avoid those bad apples having an opportunity to abuse children.
Thanks, Summer. I appreciate it. I'm going to turn it over to Ashley now for our next panelist.
Thank you, Kayla. So next up, we have a longtime school board member, Richard Barrera. Richard, you've actually been on the school board since, I believe, 2008. Yeah. And you also had a task force of your own recently look at the issue of student safety. And as I understand it, with an aim to maybe improve the system, yeah. Sort of as it stands, and that coordination between the different agencies that might field these kinds of complaints. Yeah. Just to start, I mean, we know, unfortunately, San Diego Unified and other districts across town haven't perfectly followed the law in every case, or even best practice when it comes to receiving these complaints, reporting them, investigating them, disciplining those employees when these issues come up. And for one reason or another, different cases have varied as maybe explanations for that. But do you have an idea of why these cases sort of across the board aren't always following the same book and set of rules? And does that concern you at all?
Yeah, I mean, this was the reason that, we asked the superintendent to form the task force and to pull together, the relevant agency heads, including Summer in the district attorney's office. It became apparent in our conversations in the task force that although I think our policies are clear and our chief counsel on human resources updated the policies and brought board policy updates in 2017. The problem is, I think there was this very little education among our students, among our employees about how to follow the policies, and even very simple notions that Summer talked about, reporting to child abuse hotline. It was clear, and you'd hear, teachers who participated in our discussions saying that they felt there were gray areas. They felt that there were situations that they didn't know should they report something. They didn't necessarily feel comfortable that if they reported something, it would be handled the right way. If it went to the principal, or it went, to people who might know the person that they were, reporting about. And were, afraid of repercussions. Well, this is my colleague. I see this person every day. Do I really want to have an awkward relationship, with this person? Or shouldn't I be giving this person the benefit of the doubt? All of those types of, issues that staff, would identify, rather than just, having a very clear, I don't need to think, these issues through. I don't need to have, a ton of evidence myself. If I feel that there's something that's uncomfortable, I should just report it. So I think the communication, with our staff needs to improve. And I think one big missing, component from all of this has been our communication with our students. One of the, discussions that became obvious, and I think, to the other panelists, that this would be something you'd be very familiar with. Often students know much more than adults, about what's going on with other students. And we had a couple of student members on our panel that they, made the comparison to, as school shootings have become a bigger issue, and people and students have become increasingly aware of it, students are becoming more comfortable and, understanding that if there's something that they think needs to be reported, they're more likely to report it. But that hasn't translated over, to issues of, sexual abuse and harm to other students. And so, education, I think, is the most important thing that our district, or probably most school districts, should be doing. I would guess that most school districts on paper have policies that, that are fairly clear, but that doesn't mean that people understand how to follow those policies. And I think there's also, a real distinction that needs to be made and needs to be understood between a law enforcement process. If an adult is, potentially committing a crime, that's not a process that school personnel should be investigating. That's a different, set of issues than a typical personnel investigation. And so the infrastructure within a district, human resources, is kind of set up to do personnel investigations. And if we think there needs to be discipline of some sort of an employee, but that's different from a criminal investigation. And so, for instance, we don't want principals, being the first line of criminal investigation. That's not what their job is. That's not what they're trained to do. It's actually very inappropriate, that they would, be conducting those types of conversations. Very inappropriate. I don't know exactly how the investigation happened in Mariah's, situation, but you don't want, other adults at a school being the people who are, the first people to talk to Mariah about what her, experiences as an abused student have been. We've got professionals, for instance, at Children's Hospital, that know how to conduct forensic interviews at all levels. With younger students, it's even, the training required to conduct those interviews in a way that doesn't re-victimize, kids, is just not something that school personnel, should or are able to do. So I think, distinguishing between the criminal process and, personnel investigations is important. And again, I, just come back to the need to do more education of our staff and of our students.
No, and I appreciate that answer. It was really wide-reaching and touched upon a lot of things that triggered memories for me of different cases that I've covered across town. But just on your final point, one of the recommendations I think of that task force was to really further clarify, okay, Principal A, you are not the first point of contact when a student is coming forward and saying their teacher grabbed them. Again, they are going to be part of that process on the periphery maybe, and there maybe will be employee discipline, even if it doesn't end up in charges. But that law enforcement does need to be brought in right away.
Absolutely.
Just to clarify that. To your point, just briefly on the, peers looking at other peers, I recall a case, out of La Costa Canyon High, where the only reason that school administrators were remotely aware that something was going on was because another teacher first noticed, a lot of time being spent between a teacher and a particular student, whether in the classroom during lunch hour or outside of school. And he actually spotted them off campus, like on the weekend, and just thought that was odd. He wasn't totally sure, but he did report it. And the school district, or the school, and then eventually the district, did call them in and try to confirm it and investigate. And unfortunately, at the time, it didn't go anywhere. And years later, only did everybody learn, and did the student go to police, that there was a full-blown relationship happening. But there is that need for fellow employees to feel free and not fearful of, like you said, they don't have to have all the facts, but sometimes it's just that extra set of eyes, or like you said, the students, having those conversations with students who are there and maybe noticing things. A lot of Mariah's case, and the issues, a lot of it happened in the classroom in full view of everybody else. And so their case broke down like a couple dozen interviews of witnesses of certain aspects that could be easily confirmed. So I wanted to talk to you too about, in addition to your school board job, you work with labor unions, grocery workers, right? Separate from the school district.
I did.
You did. Okay, Pat, sorry. A little behind the curve, but you're very familiar with union contracts and sort of, I'm hoping you can talk about the employee protections that are in place when a complaint is made. Obviously you don't just, fire a teacher the second a complaint is received. Could you kind of walk us through a little bit of that, and what are the employees' rights? And there is this tension there, right, between wanting to make sure these complaints are taken seriously, but teachers aren't, kicked to the curb, unnecessarily. And we know there are obviously cases of false reports. Just to be clear too, as like a little disclaimer here, we only get our hands as a public, as the media, on these documents when there has been discipline given out to these teachers, and usually that's after a school district investigation, or they've been proven credible or substantiated in some way. So if a complaint is made and investigated and they're like, no, this is just junk, and obviously a lot investigations district to district can look very different, but we're only reporting on those cases that we can confirm, and we only get those documents that the school district has found to be credible. But I'll let you take it from here. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, and obviously it's critical that employees have due process protections, on any issue that could come up, and it would be a bad work environment if teachers or other staff at schools felt that anybody could accuse them of anything, and they didn't have the ability to go through a process with thorough investigation and having a chance to have representation from labor representative. All of that is important, and of course I believe that's important in any workplace. But it does set up a challenging dynamic, I will say. And when we started to work with the multi-agency task force, the teachers union jumped right in, and the leadership of the teachers union jumped right in, precisely because what I've heard people say today, that the people who are often most troubled by a situation are peers. And the last thing that you want is people in the teaching profession feeling that that the public is looking at them as predators. And so I think teachers are probably as aggressive about wanting to make sure that these policies are enforced, and that the education of staff happens, and the teachers union took a leadership role in that. But I think one of the issues that you've described is So if this is happening through the employee discipline process and personnel investigation, process, as a school board member, we only hear about these cases when they come to us and the superintendent or the director of HR or the chief counsel is ready to make a recommendation for us, to follow through on some form of discipline. And I can tell you that the first impulse of every school board member that I've ever served with and myself is get kids out of harm's way immediately. That's the first thing that we want to do. And, without speaking about specific cases, I've got very specific situations in my mind where we felt that as somebody was going through, the employee discipline process with their due process rights, intact, kids were potentially vulnerable. If you had somebody in a classroom or you had somebody who was being exposed to kids. And so, the first thing that we want to do is not wait, to go through a process where kids could continue to be at risk. We want to get, kids out of harm's way. And so we want to remove adults from a situation where kids are potentially at risk. And, I certainly don't agree with the idea of non-disclosure agreements that you sort of push a problem into some other school district where somebody could continue to abuse kids. That's wrong. But figuring out how to get an adult away from kids while the process is going on is always going to be the first thing that school board members want to do. And, and so then, how that, ends up resulting in a discipline. And of course, often the quickest way to resolve a discipline process is through some sort of settlement agreement, so, the issues that you deal with are how do you quickly get kids out of harm's way while due process rights of employees are being protected. And hopefully that does not result in, creating future problems that can put other kids in harm's way, but it's a real issue.
Right. And I know districts for years have shared that it is that arduous, often lengthy, costly termination process that is totally playing in their mind as they enter these negotiations and settlement agreements that a lot of people, once they are brought to light are just sort of shocking. And we don't have a ton of time today to unpack that discipline process, and it goes up to the state and all of that. And we do hope to revisit this topic for anyone interested in maybe a mini podcast series later this year or another future event in live in person where we can get into some more of that. But yeah, you bring up a lot of good points there, and there's a lot that factors into those decisions. I also think that Billie Jo Grant might have some ideas, and I know that her organization has made efforts to make some statewide changes so that school districts maybe have more freedom to move in these sort of circumstances, again, when there is a credible complaints filed. So lastly, and definitely not least, I did want to tackle briefly San Diego Unified, I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys have sort of addressed this issue of social interaction, online interaction with students in a new way, in a much bigger way, now that COVID-19 is here and online learning is happening across the board. You guys have actually put together a manual and a guidebook of sorts for employees. We actually have a visual of some of those new requirements for employees, some of which were mentioned by Summer as well as sort of her recommendation. But could you talk us through a little bit about what teachers, are being told now and what restrictions have been placed on them at this time?
Yeah, absolutely. So our as part of the overall, training that we've been going through with teachers to distance learning, our human resources department has jumped in and said, part of the training has to be how do you interact with students in a way that, continues to protect students from predatory behavior. And so a few of those basic ideas, for instance, and I think it's consistent with some of the things that Summer was talking about, a typical setup of let's say a virtual classroom is that there will be time where the teacher is working with the entire class. And then there will be time that teachers are working with students either individually or in small groups. That's what happens in a classroom every day. And so trying to, kind of recreate that online is the right thing to do. However, if a teacher is working online with an individual student, the guidance is get another teacher, to participate in that discussion with you. So you've got, two adults, another set of eyes that, are part of that conversation. And if that's, if you can't do that, if there's not another teacher or another, school employee that's available to be part of that conversation, do it in a way where there's another adult who's present, when that conversation is going on. They're a parent or, another adult in the home. Certainly do not carry on, any interaction with students outside of the platforms that have been set up, for virtual learning. So you're not joining, Facebook, you're not, becoming a Facebook friend with your students. You're not participating in other forms of social media. You're not texting outside of the context of, virtual learning. And something that continues that was put into place by HR before the COVID epidemic was computer software that can raise flags. If an adult, member of the staff who's using the platforms that they're supposed to be using in school, if certain words come up, if there's a pattern that comes up, that's immediately flagged by HR. So that continues, and is probably even more important now, in this move to online learning. And I guess the last thing that I would say, and I think it was an important discussion, our students are extremely vulnerable right now. The majority of the students in our district live in poverty to begin with. We know that, we've got families who are losing their jobs, losing hours. The stress, on kids is enormous. The transition to distance learning, we're trying to do the best that we can, but we know it just doesn't work, for many students. And so knowing that students are vulnerable right now and knowing that it's our job as a district to try to reach students and identify those vulnerabilities and try to, help with that process. It scares the hell out of me, frankly, that if you've got a predator that's becoming more aware of a student's family situation, personal situation, than they might have, had access to, before, that you can exploit those vulnerabilities. So it's something that, we certainly want to hear from, Summer and from, advocates, experts about ways to protect students, in this time, because the vulnerabilities are there and the relationships between adults and students is probably more personal now, than it has been when students are in school.
Absolutely. And on that note, we will bring our expert researcher on, and I will hand it to Kayla. But thank you, Richard, for sharing all of that.
Dr. Billy Joe, anyone who might have questions for any of the panelists, we're going to be doing a Q&A session after this, so feel free to let us know and we'll get to those. Hi, Billy Joe. Thanks for joining us. I was saying before we ended up talking that we've been talking for a while about your research and your various data points that you have on teacher misconduct across the nation. And just for some background, again, you are a board member for a nonprofit, Stop Educator Sexual Abuse, Misconduct, and Exploitation. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about your research on this topic of inappropriate teacher-student interactions online and what that means now?
Sure. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of data out there, as you know. And so it's very difficult to know how often this happens. And so that's often a question we get from folks is, how big of a problem is this? And so one of the things we've been doing at Sesame is collecting Google alerts for how often these cases happen. And because there's no national database on these issues, so if you were to ask the Department of Education how often this happens, they don't track the number of cases. If you were to ask Department of Justice how often this happens, they cannot filter the cases by this type of crime, because the crimes that they are committing are not necessarily falling to educator sexual misconduct. That's not a type of crime. The crime is more general, like sexual assault. And so one way for us to do that was just start collecting how many cases show up on a Google alert, which essentially every time there's a headline that a teacher was arrested for sexual misconduct of a student, we charted it. And so starting in 2014, we started keeping track of those. And so we usually have 1 or 2 come in every day, a headline. And this is teacher arrested, again, not a conviction, but teacher arrested. And that's the headline that'll pop in. So it ranges from 450 a year up to 700 a year since 2014 and that's across the US. But that's some of the research we've been doing. And then we took a deeper dive into the database from 2014 and actually went in and coded a lot of those cases. So pulled the case files as much as we could from the publicly available data. And so we were able to see, well, was technology used? What was the type of crime? How old was that victim? How old was the offender? How did it happen? And we had over 100 variables that we collected from those cases. And so that, again, it's sad. That's the best data that we have right now about this topic, but that gives you a glimpse into how often this is happening. And it's essentially, these are only the cases that are in the paper. And as Richard and Summer would know, a lot of these cases don't ever make it there. They get handled internally. They might not necessarily be egregious cases. They're kind of unethical cases where folks might be transferred from district to district, or it's swept under the rug, or different types of things. So the research does say that about 95% of cases are handled internally, and that the results that we have would only represent about 5% of those cases that are actually being reported in the paper.
Mm-hmm. And we talked a few weeks ago, and you said that in some ways students right now are safer at home from sexual misconduct and abuse while distance learning is happening, but in other ways they're more at risk for online predation inside and outside of schools. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so the physical access to students is limited with the stay-at-home order, obviously, but access to these students on social media platforms or email is where we need to have the concern for these grooming type behaviors that are occurring. So the worry is really going to be when we come back to school, the grooming and all these boundary crossing behaviors that will have happened while kids are at home on their devices, many times unsupervised. And so finding ways to monitor the communication of teachers, and as Richard mentioned, the things that San Diego Unified is doing, but even that parents can do to monitor their devices. So many of these boundary crossing behaviors happen in what they call secrecy or shadows. And so trying to find a way to shine light on all those areas that these students might be not want you seeing their Instagram account or their Facebook or the different apps that they're using, but that's where we need to shine light on those things so these boundary crossing behaviors don't happen.
Mm-hmm. What red flags should parents be looking out for, and who should they reach out to if they have concerns about their child and their teacher? Yeah,
I think a big red flag is that one-on-one communication. If a teacher's spending an unnormal amount of time communicating with a student one-on-one, and it's not just, hey, practice is at 4:30 today or something more generic like that, but that checking in with the student, that emotional connection, those aren't okay behaviors. It does, as Richard and Summer mentioned earlier, it is sometimes really difficult to tell if it's a teacher that's going above and beyond and being that really caring teacher that's checking in on a child, and then a teacher that's intentionally grooming that child into eventual abuse. And so the line's really, really hard. It's a very gray area to figure out, well, was that okay behavior or was it not? And the more that a district can do to identify what grade behaviors are acceptable or not, the easier it makes it for administrators to know, hey, you know what, you're not supposed to text a student one-on-one. That's our policy, instead of leaving it as a gray area. So the more that we can define those gray areas, it makes it easier for parents and administrators to be able to protect kids. But as far as reporting, parents should report to the school district. There should be a Title IX officer in every school district that these reports should go to, and that's where these kind of, that didn't feel right, or that was really weird behavior or odd behavior, that Title IX officer can keep track of those things, and that's why it's supposed to go to that central reporting location. So that way, if one parent said that was creepy, another one did, they can put those pieces together in that central location and figure out and be able to connect those pieces. But if we're always reporting to, say, different principals throughout that district, or even going to different administrators, there's no way to connect the dots. So that's the role of the Title IX administrator and why it's so important to report to them.
You touched on this, but what's an appropriate line of questioning for a teacher who wants to support and check in on a vulnerable student but doesn't want to cross the line?
That's a really good question. I think the point about checking in on students and seeing how they're doing, the more you can make it in a public environment where it's an app that's monitored by the district, to where that communication, it's not just you, there's always somebody else in that communication that's the third party. It's when it becomes that secretive one-on-one communication that's in that random Facebook chat or the text message that you have to be really careful. So always having it be where there's that third party involved, if it's a parent, or that it's always a group text, or that there's always somebody watching in those group scenarios.
I think too, if I could chime in just briefly, for what it's worth, I want to say it was the County Office of Education who put out some communication about this, that urged teachers to ask questions that are open-ended, but are kind of like, tell me, if they contact their students, how is distance learning at home different than learning at school? So that leaves the door open for them if they are being abused at home, and that is falling in the gaps that we see now, to maybe open up and share, but isn't, outright prying or, again, exploiting the situation in an inappropriate way, or assuming too much, if a child is perfectly fine at home. So that's something that I want to say the County Office of Education put something like that out that comes to mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. And stepping back, what are the largest gaps in the safety net for students that you've seen in your research?
I think Richard really hit the nail on the head with it. We need to have policies, and that's where every district should start, is that, do we have good policies in this area that we prohibit this behavior, and that we set the cultural tone for our district that this is not tolerated and we're going to prosecute those that are committing these types of behaviors. But then making sure everybody's educated, not just the administrators, but we have to get the staff, we have to get the students, we have to get the parents. And so we can't just have the policy written down. Everybody's got to be educated about what to do and how to do it, so that if they're equipped to identify these warning signs and they know where to go if they have them. So I think that's a big gap right now, is just making sure that everyone's educated on what it is, that this is something that happens. Unfortunately, it's not all educators. 99% of them are amazing human beings that are in this to do the best by every student that's going to school. But unfortunately, there are some bad apples, and they're going to go where the kids go. And so we have to make sure we're doing everything we can to keep them out of our systems.
Got it. And one more question, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about what kind of advocacy work is Sesame doing now to make improvements on this issue in California, and how does California compare to other states?
Yeah, one of the biggest things right now is the ESSA Act passed a requirement that all states need to have a law that bans what they call passing the trash. And you all have alluded to this earlier, where districts will pass a teacher along that's been accused of sexual misconduct to another district. And they might know that there was egregious things happening, but oftentimes it can be easier for them in that it's not in the paper. They don't have to deal with the lawsuit. The parents are happy because it's not in the paper. Their student doesn't have to testify. And that teacher goes along to another district and becomes somebody else's problem. And the ESSA law, which passed in 2016, requires all states to have a law prohibiting that type of behavior. And right now, California does not have that in place. There are, I believe, 7 states right now that have it currently in place. Sesame is actively advocating for all states to have that legislation. It's very, unfortunately, difficult to get that legislation passed. We actually tried last year in California to get it passed, and it was not voted in, and that would be a whole nother conversation. Right. But we do need to have those laws put in place, especially in California, to be able to better protect our students. So,
right, and that was the second time that law didn't go through, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, appreciate that. If anyone wants to chime in, feel free on anyone's comments. We're going to switch over now to the Q&A portion, and I'll have Ashley pick one of those questions from the audience. But if anyone wants to chime in,
Yeah, feel free to send in and comment with any new questions that you guys have. And thanks for being patient as we work through a lot of material here and lots of information to get through. And again, we're only scratching the surface, the tip of the iceberg in a lot of this, if you get familiar with this topic. But one question that came in that I wanted to touch upon right away, let's see, Crystal Troll, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, regarding San Diego Unified policies. How are students being informed about the new policies around having more than one adult on any virtual interactions, so they also know what's appropriate and what's not? Do you know, Richard, if students have received some version of that manual or are going to in the future, or if they should? And also, if you could also touch upon, I know from prior reporting, past student victims said that they maybe wished that there was maybe like a school assembly that better explained this, or I don't know if improvements have been made to the student manual or something, but talk about that if you would.
Yeah, well, so one of the recommendations of our multi-agency task force that the board approved was a student education campaign. And we've got an elected student board member, who was prepared to, to work with us to lead that campaign. That is something that needs to happen, but of course it's something that when the world changed and everything shut down and everybody was just trying to figure out how to transition to distance learning, is one of the things that hasn't happened yet. But it's certainly something that can happen, and we may not be able to do a physical assembly, right now with students, but there are a lot of, ways that we can do mass communication and mass education of students. And it is important that that education is partly led and delivered by students themselves. So that is something that absolutely we should be prepared to do.
Because even if a policy is buried in a student manual, I mean, I don't know if I ever read those things cover to cover, so I don't know if that would quite cut it, especially in this day and age.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. This is a little bit tangential, but still important. James Hicks wants to know, when children are groomed by peers, how can teachers, parents, and law enforcement stop that kind of activity? And I'm just going to open that up to the group to see who wants to tackle that one. Any thoughts? I think Summer might want to chime in, maybe.
I'm going to try to, yeah.
Okay.
So this is kind of one of the biggest confusion points too in the reporting statutes, because when there's kid on kid abuse, we've seen those cases where it doesn't get reported. And that's really important, that the child abuse has to be reported, even if it's a minor on a minor. There's also, we've had like some domestic violence cases where it's a boyfriend beating up their girlfriend on school grounds, but it's considered this affray that it's just a student on student squabble, when it's actually domestic violence that has to be reported. And we've seen other more egregious incidents that we've been able to prosecute, but I can't talk about them because I can't talk about prosecutions in juvenile because of the protection over juvenile. But there's a lot of confusion in that area that's something that we have to, both as a society, watch out for. Those are the kind of the gender inequities that begin at a very young age with these abuses that really continue in college to promote a rape culture with fraternities and other things, where we see that a young college girl is at the highest risk of being raped. When you're supposed to be at the height of your life on a college campus, and it's usually, again, by known perpetrators. So while we don't want to bring down the hammer on kids doing making misjudgments, but it has to be reported, and there has to be a way to address it. And for most kids, most crimes with kids, they're going to get sealed. There's going to be restorative justice. There's going to be other ways to handle it, but those ways will prevent that person into turning into a full-blown predator in the future. Science is the research is showing as a positive point that while there's really no good research that adult sexual predators can be reformed through education and rehabilitation, there is science and research behind minors and kids who misbehave sexually, getting the right education and prevention and psychological intervention that then find a better path, but that must be reported. So I just say that it's serious, and that the teachers shouldn't sweep it under the rug. It has to be reported and dealt with, and it's actually mandated to be reported.
Talking just one thing I wanted to mention, talking about bringing those, that education support alongside even students underage that, are involved in something like this, to some extent with another peer, willingly or unwillingly, but just that importance of bringing those supports around that student to possibly, reform that behavior and help them to understand. This is sort of a different topic, but it just reminded me that a lot of the students I've talked to over the years who are part of these cases with their teachers, looking back, say, man, I really wish I was put in touch with a counselor or somebody to help me understand the way this relationship with my teacher had developed into something highly inappropriate, and the way that I was preyed upon and didn't even understand what was happening, because then I hear from them, years later often, and there's now baggage there and so much harm that was caused that they have to now unpack with a counselor that they think and believe would have really helped them, earlier on, years before, while it was actually happening. And so they hope that schools, put them in touch with counselors and therapists to help understand what has happened to them, and process it and move forward in a productive way. I've got another. Oh, go ahead.
Ashley, that is so right, Ashley, and an important point, because most of the cases we prosecute, the victim is still in the state of thinking that she or he may be in love with the perpetrator because of the time that is taken to groom, where you feel that you're actually in a relationship and you don't understand till much later. So they feel that they don't want to cooperate. But then the cases where we get late reporting have the difficulties of proving because it's much later in time. But those victims have now realized the impact on their life and how devastating and how they were victims. So it's both sides, and counseling is so important.
Absolutely. Another question here from Edwina Hardaway. We know that child predators do groom their victims, which is what we're talking about here. What are some warning signs that elementary grade students should be taught to recognize? Anyone have a thought on that?
A lot for elementary, it's difficult, but it's mostly around the good touch, bad touch, and that nobody needs to be touching your private parts, that you don't need to be sitting on the teacher's lap or things like that. So trying to create clear understanding of what is a good touch and what's a bad touch, and that your body's yours and no one else should be touching it. When they get older, they can make those decisions, but when they're young, it's just nobody's touching you. We can leave it at that.
And Billy Joe is correct. And I would add to that because like everything is about clear rules, especially with young kids. And, some clear rules, like you cannot accept a gift from anyone without having that gift first come to your parent, and the parent and you together may accept that gift, so that you give a really, really clear. The other thing that I teach whenever I talk to elementary school kids, which I love, their brains are so amazing, but I actually have them practice on a loud voice saying no. And we teach our kids to be respectful, and especially girls, to be nice. And kindness and niceness are two different things. You can be kind, but you don't have to be taught to be nice about things that you're uncomfortable with. That's all, teaching that it's okay to say no, just a flat out, and it doesn't matter if it's someone in your circle of trust. So just practicing that no voice too.
Absolutely. I'm actually remembering a phone call I had, I don't know if it was a year or two ago, Christy Heiskala, I know she's tuning into this. She has, again, firsthand experience with this as well, and has now taken on a career training people to try to prevent these issues. But I remember something that she said, which was, even at the youngest of age, having that ownership over their body and teaching them that. And it could even be in small ways, like, obviously to some extent, letting your kid pick out what they want to wear and wear their hair a certain way, and not forcing them to give hugs to even those relatives and trusted people, like letting them have that ownership and agency so that it's part of their DNA when they do go to school or wherever they're going to go, all throughout life. And so I have a kiddo now, and so that's like playing in the back of my head, just to start early, and really get them trained up.
If I could just jump in, one of the issues that unfortunately has become politicized, in our district, and I know it's happening around the state and around the country, research-based appropriate sex ed is extremely important, for our students, and we need to be able to deliver, that education. And, one of the things that I worry about is when we have, folks who, for whatever reason, religious beliefs, political ideology, try to push for school districts to eliminate research-based sexual education from our curriculum. The people who are going to get hurt by that are the kids. And so it's just something that, we have to be able to have substantive, honest conversations about what is appropriate sexual education, what is actually happening in our schools versus, some of the rhetoric that you hear out there. But it's so critical that we continue to do that, and I think school board members just have to stand strong to make sure that that continues in our curriculum.
Yeah, those board meetings have been a little bit bit intense on that topic.
Yeah.
Definitely don't envy you in those moments.
No.
But sex education is absolutely a component of this that hopefully helps students understand their bodies and what's appropriate and inappropriate.
Yeah.
Did we want to do one more, Kayla, or did we want to wrap up and revisit this in the future?
Since you mentioned Christy, I'll just finish up with the question that she had. So Christy Heiskala, she asked Richard, as you mentioned before, this is not something principals are necessarily trained to handle, and that's where many students feel like that's their first reporting, the person that they go to report to. What's the policy at San Diego Unified for when a student or parent notify the school that something like this has happened?
So any notification has to go to two places. One, is mandated reporters, as Summer and I think you, Kayla, talked about. We've got to report to the child abuse hotline. We've got to, and we should immediately report to law enforcement, if we believe that, danger is imminent. And then from a personnel investigation standpoint, we have a quality assurance office in our district that we encourage reports to come to. Those are anonymous. And whether it's a parent or a student or a staff member, they're protected in doing that reporting. And, so it's obviously understandable that, a parent or a student or even a staff member may feel like the first place that they go to is their principal. And if they do that, the principal's job is to report on both the, criminal side and then to report to quality assurance. But, for all of the, very understandable reasons, if anybody is uncomfortable, reporting to the principal, we actually encourage report it to quality assurance first. And that's where the investigation really should be happening within the district.
And if I can add that this is why we created the Student Safety Task Force, or that's one of the driving reasons, is because sometimes people don't know where to report, or when they report, they think there's radio silence, but sometimes it's because the school or law enforcement is investigating. So being able to let them know that it's taken care of without giving them information that could compromise the investigation. But then sometimes we find out that that actually people used a standard they shouldn't use for reasonable suspicion. And what I absolutely have to emphasize here, and I emphasized it in a recent 2,000-person Catholic assembly that the bishop brought about and he allowed me to speak about this reporting, is that reasonable suspicion does not mean you get to decide the credibility of the victim, because that's not your job to decide whether you believe the victim. Remember that sexual victimization it almost transforms victims, where they start cutting, they start using drugs, alcohol, being truant. So the very things that drive them to become not credible are then used against them to say that they're not credible. So this is why it's really important that reasonable suspicion means something happened and there's a reason. It's not like a man from the moon came down and did this to me. You report it and you let us in law enforcement decide the credibility through an objective evaluation of the evidence.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to put on the screen again some information about your portal and complaint system. There's some phone numbers again for folks who have any concerns that could link directly to the DA's task force. Do we have that website too, Megan, I think? Okay, this is a shortened link for you if you can grab it. But that's certainly an option for people that we want to make available as well. I know I speak for Kayla and myself that we were just so thrilled to have you all here to share and dig into the good, the bad, and the ugly on this topic and what's being done and what remains to be done going forward, and these new challenges that have been brought up with this new reality that we're all living in, especially in the world of education. There were a lot of good questions that we didn't get a chance to get to. We do plan to revisit this topic in the future, either in person or in a podcast or something. So stay tuned for information about that in the next several months. But do check out voiceofsandiego.org. We've got a lot of different stories that tackle a lot of different topics on this issue, quoting these very folks sitting before you. And we just thank you for your time and appreciate you tuning in. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.